IoT devices and other smart connected equipment have increased the amount of data being created outside of the traditional data center environments. As businesses look to leverage this data to make smarter, more accurate decisions, edge computing has emerged as a new paradigm to deploy infrastructure and applications in the field. However, this shift has created new challenges for IT in terms of managing, securing, and scaling these remote systems. Leveraging automation at the edge is paramount to help organizations connect devices, applications, and data in order to discover, decide, and take action. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this on-demand webcast brought to you by Red Hat and featuring Insight, a Red Hat Premier partner in IDC. My name is Jim Malone. I'm a senior content strategist working with CIO Marketing Services, and we're delighted you could join us. We're here today to discuss the intersection of edge computing, automation, and artificial intelligence. And with us are representatives from IDC, Red Hat, and Insight. So let's meet our speakers. First, I'd like to welcome Kelly Swit. Kelly is the Global Senior Director for Edge and AI Sales Development with Red Hat. Hi, Kelly. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about your role at Red Hat.
Thank you for having me, Jim. So as Jim had stated, I work at Red Hat. I actually run the sales organization across our global footprint, focused on how Red Hat is going to be extending its product portfolio and what we have grown in trust with the enterprise and the data center out to the edge. My team primarily focuses in some very key industries for us, which is the telecommunications sector, the industrial, as well as manufacturing. And I'm really looking forward to this dialogue today.
Excellent. Thanks so much for being with us, Kelly. Now let's say hello to Carm Taglienti, Distinguished Engineer and Portfolio Director with Insight. Hi, Carm. Thanks for joining. What can you tell us about Insight and your work there?
Thanks, Jim. So again, as Kelly had mentioned, thank you for having us, and certainly we'll look forward to the conversation. So what I do at Insight is I manage our portfolio of products which are related to data and AI as well as intelligent edge. So fundamentally, as a technology consulting organization, Insight looks to deliver full service solutions by leveraging the capabilities of our partners like Red Hat to be able to understand how to deploy solutions that directly address customer problems. So in general, in this conversation, we're going to talk about how can you use the intelligent edge and AI capabilities in order to address customer challenges related to the edge. So looking forward to it.
Thanks, Carm. Thanks so much for joining us. And now let's welcome our IDC analyst, Dave McCarthy. Hi, Dave. Welcome. Tell us your official title and then tell us what's keeping you busy these days at IDC.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. So I'm a research vice president, and I'm responsible for our cloud and edge infrastructure research. And what's interesting is, from an edge computing perspective, really trying to make sure we're very clear about what we talk about when it comes to edge, what the market opportunity is and sizing around edge computing and the hardware, software, and services that go along with it. But more importantly, how enterprises and other customers are using edge computing to create differentiation in their business, and whether that's in industries like manufacturing and retail and healthcare, or just a whole bunch of different horizontal use cases that are applicable to almost all organizations. It's an area that I've been looking at now for at least 4 years or so, and so very interested and excited to share some of those insights with everyone today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dave. So glad you could be with us. Now, before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items to help you get the most from today's session. First, we're coming to you on demand. That means we can't take your questions in real time, but we still want to hear from you. Just use the Ask a Question widget on your player. We'll get your question and we'll get back to you in just a couple of business days. I also want to mention that you can download a copy of today's presentation to share among colleagues, friends, customers, etc. So we highly recommend you take advantage of that. And finally, check out the additional resources section of your player. There you'll find lots of great resources from our sponsor that you can download to really take a deep dive into this really important topic. Finally, a big thanks to our sponsor, Red Hat, for making today's event possible. We've got a lot to cover. It's going to be a great discussion, that is. So let's dive right in. And to do that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Dave McCarthy with IDC for kind of a big picture market overview. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So one of the things I mentioned is it's always good to sort of level set on definitions. And If you've been in the industry and you've talked to people before, you often hear this concern around multiple definitions of edge computing, and I understand why people say that, because sometimes people talk about edge computing in terms of capability. Is it a highly capable heavy edge, or is it a lightweight sort of edge? Or sometimes people talk about edge in terms of location. Is it the on-premises edge, or is it something like in an industry specific thing like a retail edge? And the list goes on and on. But from an IDC perspective, one of the things that we believe is true is that edge computing really represents a shift from centralized computing architectures to distributed. And really the whole idea is moving infrastructure and applications closer to where data is being generated and consumed. And of course, people do this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's performance related in terms of latency back and forth from where users are and where maybe cloud resources might be. In other cases, it's related to cost, because the expense of moving data around can be concerning for certain companies. You see sort of security and compliance. And then even more recently, you see more people looking at edge computing as a way of building resiliency into their systems. And so, it's important to say that edge computing isn't replacing other things. It's an actual augmenting what companies are really doing and doing it in a different way. And we're certainly seeing a lot of interest from enterprises, and it's a big market opportunity. According to IDC forecasts, we believe this market will be $324 billion in 2026. And that's inclusive of all the hardware, the software, and most importantly, all the professional services and things that get wrapped around that. And when we ask enterprises about their adoption plans and rates for introducing edge computing into their environments, 74% said they plan to increase their spend on edge computing over the next 2 years by an average of 37%. So even in tough economic times, companies are looking at this as an important technology trend and an ability that they want to incorporate into their business. Now, of course, when you think about edge computing, and I said it's sort of this move from centralized to distributed, it brings up scalability challenges in a different way. No longer are you challenged with how to scale up a data center, but now you're thinking about how do I scale out infrastructure and applications to all of these remote locations. And because of that, there's a heavy emphasis on demand for automation. Automation in terms of how you deploy and manage and support all of these environments. And my final stat that I'll give you is that when we survey enterprises around sort of priorities, 63% say investing in edge automation is critical to their future plans. So just a few tidbits to get the conversation started. And Jim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Dave. Let's get Kelly Swit with Red Hat, Carm Taglianti with Insight involved in the discussion. Kelly, let's start with you. Any surprises there from Dave's comments or validation? It really seems like some interesting numbers there.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I think that Dave, fantastic insights. Edge is a huge market potential, I think, for many players in the traditional kind of IT business. And I agree with you. There's lots of different definitions. Even as we've had customers come to our most recent event, they saw kind of like real life examples, which I think help them to kind of better ground themselves into what does edge really mean. And so, what we always kind of talk about is that edge is about bringing the digital to the physical. And I think it's really great on what you articulated around the movement into more of a distributed environment instead of a centralized. I think there are a number of folks in the ecosystem, if you will, that have always kind of seen cloud as being distributed. But when we look at now the introduction of edge, I think that is reshaping the way that many have thought about the traditional cloud, and it being yet a new data center just kind of owned and operated by somebody else. And it really is more centralized compute versus what we see people really going after now when we look at the edge. Now, with that, to the point that Jim was bringing up, and I definitely want to hear Carm's opinion on this because he does a lot of work in this space. Anytime you look at kind of moving from any type of central management to something that is far more distributed, having good governance and automation around that is pretty critical. If you don't have the autonomous operations around the way that you may be managing, whether it's your hardware, your application estate, or even the function of how the people in your organization work, if you don't have some of those kind of core capabilities around leveraging an automation strategy to really drive that, I think this is part of why we have seen in the past such a slowdown on the consumption of what was IoT in the past. It becomes very hard to manage. It's untenable. And so I think that what we're seeing now, at least here at Red Hat, is with the birth of edge computing and all of the automation capabilities and some of the tools like Red Hat provide, we're seeing our customers really kind of extend that from the capabilities and what they've learned around how they've been doing cloud compute out to thinking differently about how to manage that edge. And I do think that that is going to create quite an explosion of growth in various kind of estates to really bring edge to life.
Yeah, so I will pick it up from there. And Kelly, that was amazing. So it's exactly the kinds of things I think that Dave was hitting on. So it really just focuses on the move to decentralization, I think, is critical. What we're seeing is that customers are kind of moving forward, just embracing this concept of decentralization as they think about how do I get to my consumers or even to my locations that are not part of my central data center or even of the cloud. And so this is really the key point. So if we think about the concept of point of presence or point of interaction, we can now look at it from the customer experience perspective to say, how can I address these challenges as simply as possible? Retail is a good example. We're looking for opportunities to be able to interact with our customers as they're within the store or as they're about to purchase. And so that requires us to sort of leverage this distribution model. And I think it's really just a sort of a change in phenomenon as we think about centralization allowed us to embrace or look at this shared responsibility model in the cloud. And there was a lot of ways in which organizations were able to evolve in terms of creating centralized policies, centralized application approaches. And I think the same expectation is true now of this, I'll call it the new market. We've been doing it for quite a while, but I think in general, what people are looking for with the intelligent edge is to sort of carry that same pattern forward. So we're looking at how do we create a platform that aligns directly to the convenience that we've been able to adapt as it relates to centralization of policy platforms, control. And some of the points I think Dave was making were really important too, is how do we understand some of the limitations of elasticity, for example, within those platforms, but also what are the expected capacity and performance that we would think to get out of whether it's the device maybe that's running an intelligent application, or it's a micro or macro edge, where it's sort of, further away from the point of interaction potentially, or, maybe it is the data center, but the latency is an important consideration. So there's a ton of capability embedded in there. And I think with a lot of the great work that's being done, by organizations like Red Hat, how can we automate this and make it a bit of a quote unquote easy button? I like to say this all the time, that allows us to be able to create the platform so that we're not worried about it as much as, thinking about the application itself. So clearly focusing on the application world and addressing the customer need and problems is really where we want to focus. But there's a lot of hard work that goes behind it to make it quote unquote easy, so that it relates to the typical enterprise application environment. Thanks,
Carm. Kelly, a few years ago, CSO did a survey about IoT and edge, and the number one concern was security. So I feel like we should address this kind of right away. Obviously, big difference between security when you're talking about an on-prem data center versus the edge. What are some of those differences? And within the context of our discussion today, talk a little bit about some of the things that we need to be concerned about when we talk about security at the edge.
Yeah, this is actually a huge topic. I think security, for all intents and purposes, when we think about it in the data center and traditional kind of application development, everyone kind of thinks about building the security into the way that applications are built and then deployed with whether it's in the data center or it's in the cloud. When you're talking about how we move to the edge and what security means there, it means not just at the point of deployment, it means how you handle day two operations, because you're at the furthest point of your network. And when we look at many of the cyber breaches that have taken place. In many instances, and I won't name any, but in many instances, those cyber attacks actually came from devices that were at the far end of the network. And you've got a very different complex set of thinking about how to manage that security, especially in a zero trust framework. So it doesn't just become a piece of software, a security piece of software that you deploy an agent on the hardware and it's going to protect you, or it's not just installing a firewall. It becomes inherent, intrinsic in the way that you manage the software updates, the vulnerability patching, the actual management of the network configuration to the device, how you're managing the health and state of the physical hardware of the device. The list goes on. And so the security posture and profile becomes very different. And I think that it's going to be a really interesting journey to see how in many instances, our operations technology colleagues are going to look at how they take best practices from the traditional CISO space and apply them here, but with probably a need of a twist based on the way that they have to manage the operations and the fit and purpose of these individual devices that are out in the edge.
Carmen, it's interesting. Kelly makes a really strong link between management and security. They're related. How are IT leaders getting at this issue now?
Yeah, so I think the automation is a great way to think about it. So if we think about DevSecOps or even just understanding policy frameworks, so organizations really do want to have a consistent set of policies that they want to be able to extend across the entire surface area that they might be managing. As Kelly had mentioned, now it extends all the way out to the device itself, for example, because it's a point of presence, point of vulnerability. So creating those policies and then using automation techniques to be able to update them, manage them, or even, as Kelly was mentioning, maybe there are different approaches that align to a similar type of policy. For example, maybe it's a NIST framework policy that might be associated with the protection of those devices. And it's slightly different than in the cloud, for example, versus maybe on a near edge or far edge deployment. But automation allows us to be able to centralize that so that we can say, okay, now we can manage the policy. And I don't want to bring Gen AI into this, but maybe there's even a play there for Gen AI, but maybe there's something we could do in terms of policy generation. So how can we create, say, maybe Ansible code, which allows us to be able to direct those policies toward new devices that might come into play, or have the expertise to understand what the changing environment might look like. So I think that that's kind of where we're going in the grand scheme of things. So it's sort of centralized policy management and definition, but then using like event-based architectures to be able to understand when is there a particular type of vulnerability that's been identified, and how can we then accommodate for that or shift our policies using learning behavior to be able to make sure that we can cover the entire ecosystem or surface area of what we have available to us. And it's, like Kelly said, I think it's a big area. Of course, there is no one answer. I can say that it's solvable, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to solve.
Yeah, I'd like to offer up one counterpoint on that. What's interesting is, without doubt, when you ask people about the number one concern around edge computing, security is that, right? And for all the reasons we've just discussed, and just the fact that you have a larger attack surface potentially, and to be honest, these systems are being deployed outside of traditional data center environments, so they don't have the same physical security. But the one interesting thing is, if you flip that question around and sometimes ask people, like, what are one of the benefits of edge computing, they'll say security. You'd be like, well, what do you mean by that? And really what they're saying is, for certain organizations, there is some level of comfort in being able to not move their data outside of where it is, to be able to keep it local, where they have more control over it. So there is a way to look at security from both sides of the fence.
Kelly, you're going to mention something, I think.
Yeah, I think that Carm brought up a fantastic point around thinking about how you can have some of that central policy management, but how you can kind of extend that out, because it really gets into these concepts of, how, like, where can you take some of the best practices around the way that we've been managing the cloud or managing your individual data centers, and be able to leverage those out for the growth for the edge, instead of assuming everything has to be kind of built from scratch. So I just think it's a fantastic point he brought up. And Dave, I'm totally with you. I love the idea of like flipping that question, because a big piece of what many of these industries are talking about is that data sovereignty, if you will, opportunity that edge brings to the table.
Interesting. Carm, earlier we had talked about how kind of the before picture, how folks are getting at this now. These are big, kind of by definition, complex ecosystems that you just can't deal with manually or with a kind of a best of breed shotgun approach. They really do demand kind of that, as Kelly is mentioning, that kind of overall policy, that management approach. But what's the implications of kind of not doing it that way, kind of the before picture?
Well, I think there are probably a couple of problems. One we've already identified, which is loss of control, and vulnerability. So I think that's a pretty easy one to think about. So if you have points of presence that aren't really protected, then you do have vulnerability in that exposure. I think the other one is if you do address it, let's just say, and Kelly, it's a great point when you talked about. If we create sort of point solutions and we say, oh, you know what, at the edge, we've created this custom version of protection, or, we can ensure that particular device or, an edge location is protected according to the constraints that we put in place, but they're not really centralized, then it's a custom solution. So now all of a sudden we've got, I'm going to call it a technology debt problem, but we're sort of creating our own technical debt by saying, yeah, we created a whole bunch of edge devices that have their own security models in place, but they're not consistent. So now I've got a management problem across the board. So I think that's the other place where, we can think about, well, how does centralization allow us to be able to accommodate that? And while it feels like it might be a big lift, I guarantee you that management after the fact is going to be much more difficult to be able to address.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to turn the conversation now toward kind of a deeper dive into the artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation part of it, speaking specifically of the edge. Kelly, it seems like everywhere you turn, you can't help read an article about AI, about its adoption, etc. What's the reality like? What are you seeing from your position at Red Hat?
Yes, I think we can all thank ChatGTP for the consistent drumbeat of AI these days. We've turned the corner, and it's becoming a little bit more ubiquitous, if you will. I see a lot of customers that are really kind of interested in how they may use AI at the edge and how to implement that effectively. But I also see many of them being able to think about how to do it at scale, because when you think about the edge is much more of a discussion around deployment and inference, especially for AI, which means that the development has happened somewhere else and it may have come from a vendor. That's actually most of what I see is vendor-based solutions and necessarily custom built. But you have so many additional kind of constraints to really think about. So a lot of it is really computer vision based, as an example. So how do I sweat the camera assets I may already have within my facility in order to bring net new value with the computer vision into the facility? If you look at manufacturing, many of these systems that they have been there for decades. And so the idea of bringing AI into that space, while there's additional value to be created, you can't necessarily integrate a brand new technology that has come out in the last year or two into technology that has been there for 30 years. And that's literally some of the facilities you have. So you end up having more of like a additive or a bolt-on feature instead of something that is really kind of a integrated, self-healing type of system architecture. So I see this as like one of the big pieces that I think many customers are really struggling with. And I think part of the conversation that we have with them is you have to start the journey somewhere, and you have to make some initial step changes into this. And so while it may be a bolt-on for day one, let's talk about what your roadmap looks like in year two, and how do we get to the place where it becomes a more tightly integrated ecosystem within your specific edge facilities. So there's just, I think it's great to see the level of excitement. And I think it's great to be on this learning journey. And we definitely have Carm on that journey with us. But I think there's still a lot to really do to get it to be intrinsically built into the systems in the edge deployments that we're seeing.
Yeah, Carm, from your point of view at Insight, anything to add from what Kelly mentioned as far as the importance here?
Oh yeah, definitely. And there's, Kelly brings up a really good point as we think about sort of I'll call it the distributed model in the grand scheme of things. And she's absolutely on point where I think what we have seen over time is we've seen point solutions that are deployed relatively easily out to the edge, but they're custom based. And so this is, and I hate to date myself, but I was doing AI 25 years ago or so. But back then we would create a solution and it would basically be a point solution on a system. And then we really struggled with how do you deploy the thing? How do you get it out there so you can actually take advantage of the fact that maybe you do have a really cool algorithm that does loss prevention or something? I think right today, we're sort of hand rolling that stuff. We're basically saying, well, we can get something out to the site. Maybe you land a box out there, you hook up a network, and then you hook up some cameras, and you've got a solution, and you run it, and it's like that's great. But the problem is the operational aspects of that are really the key. And so over the last probably 5 to 10 years, ML ops has really become a thing. And so it's been more of how do we manage the ML pipeline? How do we manage the deployed software? How do we measure erosion of the model, which is performing loss prevention or other kinds of analysis or providing value to the customer? And so I think that's the key. So automation and then allowing us to be able to take those same fundamental concepts of the AI journey and to be able to support that at the edge creates a huge amount of power for us because you're able to take advantage of the point of presence being where the activity is really happening and where the data is being generated, but you're also able to use these operational orchestrations to ensure that it runs the way it should run and provides additional value to the customer. And I think that's really something that, clearly, Red Hat and us are looking at in terms of not just creating cool solutions and getting them out to the edge, but it's more how do you embrace them and allow them to continue to run and evolve so that we can do more at the edge. And that's really, I think, the key here.
One thing I'll add is that in my mind, AI at the edge solves a lot of problems that IoT created. And I say that just in the fact that prior to me working at IDC, I spent 10 years in embedded software and industrial IoT solutions. And so I watched companies go through that cycle of investing in IoT, instrumenting equipment, collecting a lot of data. And then at the end of the day, they ended up with a lot of new data, but not a lot of new insight. And then, the progression of that was to take that data, move it to the cloud, use machine learning techniques to learn something new, and then try to implement that new idea back into the process. Even as I describe it, it was very disjointed and probably the exact opposite of automated. And so bringing that AI capability, especially on the inference side, out at the edge means that now you can close that loop. You can collect the data, you can understand the data, and you can implement the action right there where the action is. And so to me, this is unlocking finally the use cases that people have been chasing for a really long time, whether it's things like predictive maintenance in the industrial sectors or whether it's things about better understanding the customer experience and retail. So to me, it's the missing link. And I'm excited to see how companies continue to find ways of implementing it.
With Dave mentioning use cases, I want to ask our panelists now to kind of think about the after picture. That is kind of what does the ideal state look like here? And maybe we start with you, Kelly.
So the ideal state in some of the use cases that happen in AI. I can give you some examples of what we're starting to see. Well, I'll go with manufacturing as the example. So in food and beverage, especially here in the U.S., the FDA has very strict requirements on making sure, that the food is safe before it is shipped from any facility out to a grocery store for us to buy. And if you think about the way that You may do metal detection within packaged goods. That tends to be taking product from a batch, taking a random sample, if you will, bringing it to an offline room, running it through an AI system in an X-ray system in order to identify if there's any known anomalies that then would suggest that the whole batch may be bad. When you think about how that process works today, it is arduous, it is manual, and it is definitely not in line. We have a lot of manufacturers that are talking to us about how do I actually put that in the actual line of production, bringing that AI and that type of like X-ray AI that's being done. Pattern recognition is basically what they're doing. How do I bring that in line so that way, as the canned goods or the packaged goods are going down the actual conveyor system, we're identifying that in line and then binning the bad product versus the good product. It could save us on maybe not everything is bad in the batch. Maybe it was only a select component of the food. So there's value in looking at how they actually bring the AI more connected into the actual control systems and the full loop of what is happening in the manufacturing floor. And not only would help them in obviously the human labor of the operations, but in regards to being able to have more product safety, because random sampling is fantastic. Don't get me wrong, and there's always a margin of error. And if there's an opportunity to really bring that in line, there is not only operational efficiency, but there is the potential for improvement in the actual quality of the product. And so I see that many of them are really looking to how they're going to do things in that way. And to Carm's point, what that also means is that the model has to be inferenced and kept healthy in real time. There is probably less of an opportunity to continue with more of a batched traditional framework around the software development and deployment cycle, and it needs to have much more real-time capabilities to that full life cycle of the model if they start to look at how they bring that in line.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add to that in a couple of use cases that we've worked with, and I'll call it maybe progression toward ways of thinking about leveraging these capabilities. But one is around compliance. So in a food processing plant where the humans are not replaced, but through things like robotic automation. But more how, where you do have to use a human, for example, to be able to manually process food, contamination is a big issue. So the easy solution there in that particular case is to use camera-based analytics to be able to ensure that particular compliance behavior is being met. So you can write models that relatively effectively, actually very effectively, can identify where contamination may occur, saving the food processing manufacturers, millions of dollars in terms of waste, but also depending on where it's the contamination is detected within the supply chain, it's a huge amount of cost to these organizations. Like how many times have you seen recalls of things like a head of lettuce, and it's like they have to destroy an entire crop because it may have come from one particular farm, for example. So being able to do things like that is really cost effective, but also a great application and relatively simple to set up and deploy because it's camera-based analytics. So this allows us to do it very simply. The other example is really more that we see a lot in the retail arena, and it's there are a lot of different types of applications. And I think one thing that's really important to emphasize is, I think Dave's point was really, we now can, because of the point of presence, really think about sort of the art of the possible. So what kinds of things can we think about either creating efficiencies within, say, retail stores or organizations, theft prevention, fraud's just, one of them. But there are other things like maybe even safety, for example. And I'll go again to camera-based analytics, but it's more of there are cameras already in these stores. How do we leverage that data and enable ourselves to be able to do more? So, for example, maybe it is the clerk for whatever reason. You don't want the clerk putting themselves in danger by trying to prevent theft. but you can actually detect events and then maybe call law enforcement agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So there are different types of solutions that you can create that provide operational efficiencies, but also increase the safety of the workers. Maybe the experience is better for the worker as well. And then even through other things like, again, vision-based type systems on the IoT front, it's how can you self-checkout? How do you make the experience better for the user overall? And so that, they potentially are able to, facilitate a quicker checkout process, et cetera. So there are a ton of these examples, but, these things are possible because of this whole environment that's being created that allows us to be able to do this effectively.
Thanks, Carm. We've been chatting with Kelly Swit with Red Hat, Carm Taglienti with Insight, and Dave McCarthy with IDC. Unfortunately, we're almost at the end of our time for this session, but before we go, I wanted to bring Dave back into the conversation, and Dave, ask you, kind of put you on the spot for a kind of a summary of the key takeaways that we really want to leave listeners and viewers with after this session today. So, Dave, all yours.
Wow, that was a great conversation, and I imagine we could go on for hours talking about all of the interesting use cases and things. I think the important takeaways are that edge computing is presenting new opportunities for companies to solve both existing problems that maybe they haven't completely solved, and then also brand new use cases that maybe weren't possible before by moving to this distributed model where you're really being able to collect and understand and take action on data in real time out in the field. Now, certainly it does come with some challenges. We talked a little bit about security and some of the scalability of when you start bringing all of these different locations into the mix, especially with environments that aren't traditional data center environments. It takes a slightly different mindset in terms of how you design and how you build these solutions. Certainly we hear from customers that they kind of want the best of both worlds, right? They want familiarity in terms of how they manage, and they want to manage things in a very consistent way, but yet recognizing, some of the unique attributes that you find in Edge. And so it's always interesting to look for solutions that can kind of bridge those two worlds together. Lots of interesting use cases, many of them being driven by AI. And, a few times we talked about cameras now becoming kind of the universal sensor, because with the combination of edge computing and AI and these cameras, not only can you do things like object detection, but you start understanding what those objects are actually doing, and even in a forward-looking way, like what those objects might do in the future. And so, to me, all of this is just bringing together a lot of excitement in terms of the value that these technologies can bring back to the business to either improve the bottom line or create new products and services. I think the possibilities are endless. So with that, I think I'm going to sum it up and just say that, lots of potential for edge computing, lots of things to be concerned about and to think about. But the good news is that this isn't a future-looking thing. These are things that people are doing today. I certainly recommend talking to the people on this call as follow-ups afterwards, both Red Hat and Insight, to understand a little bit more about how they're helping customers through their journey and contributing to their shared success.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dave. And a big thanks to our panelists. We are at the end of our time for this session. Again, a big thanks to Dave McCarthy with IDC, Kelly Swit with Red Hat, Carm Taglienti with Insight. Thanks so much to all of you for your insights and expertise here today. This is going to help so much for those folks who are at that point in their IT evolution with edge and deployments, etc. So thank you so much. For the audience, also a big thanks for tuning in. Before we go, a quick reminder, do check out that additional resources section of your player. You can do a deep dive on this, even more information, really take advantages of the expertise and insights of our experts here today. So do take advantage there. And with that, we are at the end of our time. For Red Hat and CIO Marketing Services, Jim Malone saying, thanks everyone for tuning in.